Welcome to Work Like a Human, a podcast from Go Innovation. Welcome back to Work Like a Human. My name is Rory Tyre. I'm an executive coach and a facilitator with Go Innovation. Today we're talking about humor. And in reflecting in preparation for this episode, I was thinking about a couple of things. First, I have never thought of myself as a funny person or like the funny friend in the friend group. And I still don't think of myself that way. But in a professional setting, I am probably the person who's going to make a joke. There's something about like adding some levity to even very serious situations that I feel like as an obligation I have. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with Drew Tarvin, who calls himself a humor engineer. He founded a company called Humor That Works. He actually believes, and there's research to back this up, that humor helps people get more and better work done. And right now, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, in other words, in the midst of a crisis, it's actually more important than ever that we have an ability to find and to inject appropriate humor into different situations. So if you work on or part of a remote team or you lead people in any capacity, I think you're really going to like this episode, because if maybe like me, you've never thought of yourself as a particularly funny person, you're in luck, because using humor to get more and better work done isn't really about being a hilarious person. There's actually a simple process you can follow, and Drew lays this out for us. So let's go ahead and step into the interview with Drew Tarvin, a humor engineer. Drew, thank you so much for being willing to have a conversation with me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I heard you for the first time at the Ignite Leadership Conference here in Northeast Mississippi earlier this year, and I was just blown away. Like, I do a lot of facilitation, and so sometimes I can be skeptical of the keynote because I'm like, how much value is happening here? And like, you killed it. Seriously, one of the most effective keynotes, both in what you said, how you said it, and then the way that you used PowerPoint was just incredibly effective. So that's the first time I came across you. For anyone that's not familiar with you, in a nutshell, how would you describe what you do?
Sure, it's a great question, and I think the way that I describe it is in the sense the same name as what my company is called, and that it's humor that works. Like the focus of what I do is also kind of inherent in my made up job title, which is a humor engineer. The whole point of it is basically strategically leveraging humor as a tool or a skill set to get results with the hardest resource there is to get results with, which is other humans. And, that comes from my background in computer science and engineering, and recognizing that this humor skill was this thing that like, oh, wait, if my presentations weren't incredibly boring, but in fact had a little bit of levity to them, people actually paid attention more. Or if my emails were actually kind of entertaining, people actually responded to them. So it was, for me, as a nerdy programmer, a way to almost program humans.
This interview is not happening in a vacuum. Like, the whole world has basically been upended over the past 2 weeks because of coronavirus. Lots of people, you were just explaining to me that you've had to recalibrate a lot of in-person events to virtual. We're now like Zoom's favorite customers, basically. So we don't have this, I think of inter-office opportunities for banter, for conversation, but we don't have that right now. We're all in remote meetings. So how does humor serve us in a crisis? Like, skeptically, wouldn't it be better if we all just sort of got really serious right now?
Well, I mean, that's a great question that the listeners can kind of pose to themselves is just because times are serious, or even your work is, say, serious or is important, does that mean everything around it have to be serious? Or in a sense, is it even more important now to find ways to connect with your coworkers or your direct reports or your clients in a way that brings a little bit of levity, right? The world is already so serious. So if you were to have an interaction where you brought a little bit more joy and positivity, wouldn't that be like a welcome breath of fresh air? We still need that human connection, even though, like, I'm an introvert. Right. Even though I speak for a living, even though we do a ton of trainings every year, even though I do a lot of networking events, I'm very much an introvert where I recharge by being by myself.
Yeah.
But even as that introvert, we all need that social connection. And so finding ways to create humor opportunities, even in a virtual environment, is valuable. And that's where tools like Zoom is very helpful. Like, one of the things that my fiance does, she works at the UN, and she's discovered in Zoom that you can change your virtual background. And so she's going into some of her calls with changing her virtual background to a beach, or to, the UN logo, or to other small things that are just subtle ways to connect to make your coworkers smile a little bit, to show some horses, right? Just small things that like bring a little bit of that laughter back
Yeah.
to the workplace for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I remember correctly from your talk, you gave a number of statistics just about, like from your experience or stuff that you've researched in terms of how humor can actually help people. I mean, it sounds paradoxical, but you would say humor actually, from what I remember, humor actually helps us get more and better work done.
Sure. So part of it is, humor helps with the way that we work. So if we look at kind of the statistics for the need for humor, 83% of Americans are stressed out at work.
Mm,
55% of Americans are unsatisfied with their jobs, and 47% of Americans struggle to stay happy. You start to realize, oh, the current way of working isn't really working, not at least for the
yeah.
individual. It's not, right? Because most people's days, like it's stressed out. People are constantly busy. They're constantly
Yep.
stressed. They're worn out. They're stressed out. They're burned out. And so humor helps to counteract those negative impacts. It kind of leads to a lot of research that's been done on the value of humor. So humor in various studies have been shown to, it increases productivity, right? If you enjoy
Hmm.
your work a little bit more, you're more likely to do it and willing to do it
Yep.
for longer. If it can help to improve memory retention. So if a teacher uses humor when they are teaching a certain concept, or if you in sales are using humor as a way to explain a certain idea, then that's going to resonate more with someone a little bit later. It helps us manage our own stress, right? We know stress by itself is not a bad thing, but when you have chronic stress and never relieve that stress, that's when you run into the negative effects of stress. So humor helps us to
Hmm.
manage the stress of day-to-day things. Leaders, in one study, they found that leaders who use a sense of humor were seen as being on top of things and in control, whether or
Hmm.
not they actually were, right? So it changes people's perception of your capability and your
Yeah.
ability to get things done. So you combine all of these 30 plus benefits that I shared in the talk together, and what it leads to is people being more productive, less stressed, and happier at work.
Hmm. I mean, it makes like intuitive sense when you start thinking about it for a little bit. It just also, I mean, in your experience, when as you work with organizations, with teams, with people, do folks find this like sort of refreshingly novel? Like, why has nobody come in here and done this before? Like, how do people receive the work that you do?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because a lot of times people think of humor as this nice to have.
Hmm.
Right? They're like, if we had a little bit more fun, that would be fine. Because like no one thinks humor is a bad thing, right? No one
Right.
hates to laugh,
But it's
right?
also
No one,
not like mission critical.
yeah. And so people are like, I guess it's fine. And I'll admit there are some groups that work for. There's the older mentality that work is supposed to feel like work.
Sure.
In fact, I went into an organization once, and some guy came up to me beforehand. And he was skeptical, and he was like, "Listen, I was always told that if work was supposed to be fun, it would be called play." And it's like, well, maybe that's the old way of looking at work. But now when
Hmm.
our emotions impact our ability to get things done, to be
Hmm.
creative, to be present in a meeting, to manage the way of work has changed. It used to be that when you left work at 5 p.m., you left work.
Right.
But
Right.
now people are going home, they're picking up their kids, or that kind of, or maybe they're even working from home now, and they, do dinner and they do all that. And then they're going through email a little bit later, like how we manage work. So we have to be comfortable bringing the human self to work. And humor is a big part of that. We make the case for why it's a must have. And then
Hmm.
once people understand that, there is, like you said, there's a refreshing angle to it. They're like, wait, I don't have to dread work. I don't have to hate my coworkers. I don't have to be
Yeah.
bored to tears in my meetings. These are all things that are possible. And so
Yeah.
they get excited about it. And part of what we're doing is, the number one reason why people don't use humor in the workplace is they don't think that their boss or coworkers would approve.
Hmm.
Which one, for leaders listening to this, means that if your team or your organization isn't using humor, you're probably part of the reason why. Not
Hmm. Hmm.
necessarily intentionally, not like you're squashing it, but if you yourself aren't having fun, if you yourself aren't
Yeah.
incorporating a little bit of humor, if you yourself aren't encouraging it, people start to think like, oh, it's not welcome. And so
Yeah.
part of what we're doing is we're giving people a permission to do it. And then we are teaching them how to do it appropriately, because that's the other step to it is, right, we want to make sure that people are using humor in a way that is positive and inclusive and not going to, lead to a trip to HR or, getting fired.
So yeah, so I was going to ask, okay, so where does this go wrong, and how do we like get out in front of that before it happens?
The area that goes wrong is partially in intent. for why you're using humor. So, the goal of humor is not in the workplace is not for people to be like, oh my God, you're so funny, you should do stand-up comedy, right? Your goal is not Netflix comedy special or comedy club, get those laughs with the 2-drink minimum. Your goal is to use humor to get a specific result. And so for us, it all starts with, or is all framed around what we call our humor map. And that's your medium, your audience, and your purpose. And that helps you start to understand what type of humor to use and what type of humor will be most appropriate.
Yeah, I was had a coaching conversation several weeks ago with a younger leader. She was explaining to me, she had talked a couple of times about how they have kind of a culture of teasing, was her word, in a workplace. And so I asked her to unpack that a little bit. And I gave her a little bit of a challenge. I was like, I want you to go and think about just the simple metric that the teasing, the net result of it, does it build up the culture or does it degrade it in any way? And she'd never thought about that before. And after that, she basically came back a couple weeks later and said, you're totally right. It was not a helpful form of humor. So I think that's another example of that thing where in the moment it feels like, oh, this is funny, but I think it was essentially at someone else's expense, which is very, very different from the kind of thing you're talking about.
Yeah. And it also, that's the audience piece of the map, is recognizing that different groups and different relationships impact how humor is perceived.
Yeah.
This is a big thing that we work with when we're working with clients that are coming from the UK or Australia and they're doing work in the US, is that there's a very strong culture of banter in the UK and Australia, or what they call taking the piss. And even a phrase like taking the piss, people in the US are like, that's kind of aggressive.
Yep.
But that's like the friendly conversation piece of it. And so just recognizing that in certain cultures, oh, that kind of teasing is what bonds people closer together. Whereas for other groups, or when your status is different, right? This is a lot of times what we see with leaders is like the US is so, Americans are so, into sarcasm, that the problem is that when that's coming from a higher position, when you have a higher status and you use things like sarcasm or teasing, what you think is just kind of friendly back and forth is perceived by other people as like, oh, wow, that person is aggressive or mean.
Yeah.
And so just recognizing those differences. And I think one of the things that's really valuable to help people frame what type of humor to use is understanding psychologist Rod A. Martin defined 4 styles of humor. The first style is affiliative humor. This is positive, inclusive humor. This is Ellen DeGeneres. It's Mr. Rogers. It is like team building activities. It's happy hours. It's the, playful, fun, positive things that everyone can get involved with. Then there is self-enhancing humor. This is using humor on yourself, but it's still overly positive. It's about turning a hardship into something that's positive. So it's looking at, okay, how can I find the humor in this situation? So even something like, the pandemic that everyone is dealing with and being inside, like, okay, how can you find the humor of it? Of, oh, well, I've never really tried growing a beard, and so now is the perfect time for me to try, and it's terrible. It's like very thin, it's not coming through, but it's better for me to learn this now than when I'm in front of clients, right? So it's finding the positives in life's hardships. Then there's self-defeating humor. This is a negative form of humor where the target is yourself. This is where you're kind of poking fun at yourself a little bit. So I will often talk about that I'm a frail person. I was born 8.3 pounds and stayed that way till I was 15 years old. Right, so just jokes like that, of like jokes kind of directed at me, negative. And then there's aggressive humor. Aggressive humor is sarcasm, satire. This is kind of what you see on The Daily Show. This is what you see in a lot of kind of the banter back and forth between people. And aggressive humor can be great catharsis, right? We do some work with emergency first responders and police officers and things like that. And where stress is really high, when they're seeing really like the worst of the worst, that aggressive kind of dark humor,
like gallows humor kind of thing, right?
Gallows humor can be a great way to relieve stress. What it doesn't do, though, is it doesn't typically create change. And so as an organization overall, aggressive humor is hard to be like, oh, I'm building rapport using this type of humor. Oh, I'm getting people to pay attention. And so just having an understanding of those different styles of humor and which is appropriate in different situations can help people start to use it.
I detect kind of an interesting filter that you might recommend is, will the humor help to create some kind of a change? And is it a change that I would actually want?
Exactly. Does it go back to that purpose and being clear on it? Because a lot of times people are like, oh, okay, I'm supposed to use humor now. Does that mean I become a stand-up comedian and I just tell jokes? And like, because we've all experienced that person that's like always tries to be funny and they're not funny and it's just awkward. And it's like
totally overplayed. Like you can't be serious.
Yeah. The goal is not to be Michael from The Office, right? Michael from The Office, that character is using humor out of a sense of trying to be, have validation. As opposed to, someone that's using, I'm going to use humor at the beginning of my presentation by telling a short story that connects to my main topic of the presentation by getting people to pay attention. Or I'm going to use humor in this moment just to recharge the room because we've been like talking for 30 minutes. We need kind of an interactive exercise to get people's energies up. Like having that clear purpose really helps to use humor that's more appropriate.
I mean, my sense is this is even more important right now. I think with so many people now working remotely for the first time, especially, like it's distracting. I think you feel more distanced from coworkers and from team than normal. And so I think the urgency and the need for what you're describing is like maybe never been more important.
So we do a program that's called Remotely Effective. It's how to be more effective in a remote kind of world because we've been doing this for a while. Part of what humor does is it reminds us of our humanity in the workplace. Because so often, when we label people as resources, which I did as a project manager at Procter & Gamble, I had a list of resources on a project. We have human resources. And when you think of humans solely as a resource, you start to forget that the other person on the other side of a Zoom call or the other side of an email or, the other side of a phone call is a fellow human being, right? With a human life, they have emotions, they have feelings, they maybe just maybe the reason why an email is late to you isn't because they secretly hate you, but because they have a sick kid at home. Or because they're dealing with an elderly parent who is not feeling well, or because of all of the stuff that's going on. And so humor humanizes people. I think it reminds people of that component. It connects us as human people so that we can then be more focused on the human connections and not just on efficient, process-driven things.
Yeah, man, that's so helpful. Okay, so like a little bit more, you don't need to share your whole life story, but I am curious, like, at what point did you think like I'm funny, like I can actually do this? When did that happen?
I mean, in some ways it was early on as a kid. In other ways it was, I'm still not sure if it's true. Even after, I think about it, like right now I have some credibility factors to suggest that I am funny because I've done over 1,000 stand-up shows at this point. I have a TEDx talk called The Skill of Humor that has more than 6 million views. It's disproportionately more likes than dislikes, which I do look at because there's like 100,000 likes, but then also like 3,000 dislikes. So I'm like, all right, well, 3,000 people say that I'm not funny. 100,000 think maybe that I kind of am.
That's a decent ratio.
I think it's I think it's good enough for me to like quantify as an engineer. I should be able to say, okay, quote unquote funny.
It's 3%, right?
It's 3%.
Basically, I think.
Yeah. If I'm doing the math right, maybe it's probably even less than that.
Is it less than that? Math is not my thing. So
no, it's right at about 3%. I think you're right.
Okay.
So growing up, no, I was never the life of the party or class clown type person. I was pushed into comedy. I wasn't the person that was like, I'm going to raise my hand. I think I can do that. I'm going to be a speaker. People are going to love me. No, like I said, I'm very much an introvert. And I was going to Ohio State the Ohio State University. I have to say that, or they take away my degree. So I went to the Ohio State University, and my best friend wanted to start an improv comedy group, needed people, and forced me to join. And so we started doing improv. We watched Whose Line Is It Anyway and tried to repeat what we saw.
So good.
Such a great TV show. We were not very good. Like, you have your like your expectation of like Wayne Brady and Ryan Stiles and mockery, and then us trying to do it, and they're like, oh, this is way harder than we thought. But it was so much fun, and I fell in love with it, and it gave me the skills. I realized later when I was working at P&G that I was drawing just as much from what I'd learned in improv and later stand-up in my role as I was from my technical degree. Because I had learned how to communicate with people, how to get them to pay attention, how to have fun in my own work. And so improv and stand-up started to be like, okay, now I'm building the skill. But it was at P&G that I was like, oh, this can actually help me get better results.
Yeah, I mean, so much of that improv and stand up is about self-awareness and social
Mhm.
awareness, like being aware of what you feel and what you're doing, and then being really attuned to what others are doing. And I mean, like so many managers get promoted into management roles without having training in those
Yeah.
areas. So that, okay, I see how that can serve you. So, okay, I'm interested, like, um, I ask a lot of guests this question because I think, um, despite all kinds of literature around this, I think people still instinctively have a negative reaction to the word failure.
Mhm.
And I think, like, so coming with improv, you really have to be willing to fail. You have to hold everything with open hands and try it. Otherwise, you're never going to learn. So, what is like a significant, if there's something you're willing to bring up, a significant personal professional failure that you've experienced? What was it? What did you learn
Mhm.
from it?
You raise a great point, and changing our perception of failure. And one of the things that I've learned, and this probably comes from the world of improv, is that failure is just data.
Hmm.
Right? It's not commentary. It's not commentary on your worth as a person or your ability to do or not do something. It is simply data about how you tried something, meaning that that way you did that thing did not work. And so how can you learn from that? And that's very much the
Yeah.
stand up in the improv approach. And so,
Yeah.
speaking of am I funny or not, the fourth stand up show that I ever did was a stand up comedy competition at Ohio State. I
Hmm.
made it into the second round, and the for that particular show, they had three guest judges. The guest judges were Mark Curry. He was Mr. Cooper from a TV show called Hanging with Mr. Cooper, which I had watched growing up. So this guy who I'd seen on TV was now a judge.
Hmm.
Joe Coy, who's a very funny comedian. He's now got a couple of Netflix comedy specials, I think. And Daniel Tosh. And this was before Tosh.0. This was before he was big, but he was still a
Wow.
pretty big college comedian that people had heard of. And so
Okay.
we did, the show format is that we, as brand new amateur comedians, do 6 minutes of material. Also on stage are those three judges who are very clearly very good at what they do, sitting on stage with you at a table. You would do your 6 minutes, and then they would each comment on your set and say what was good and what was bad.
Oh,
So it's already a nerve-wracking experience. You throw into
oh
the
yeah.
fact that it was for 200 people, so the largest audience I had done up until that point. My mom was watching me perform for the first time. My brother was watching me perform for the first time. And so incredibly nervous. So I memorized my set word for word. I had it like exactly all memorized. And I get 3.5 minutes into my set and I blank, completely blank on what I was going to say next. I could not remember the next word. So
Oh
I spent
no.
30 seconds standing on stage. I looked down. I just looked at my feet and was like, wow. Uh, sorry. Wow. Did that for 33
Oh
seconds.
my
I have the video proof
goodness.
of it. Eventually, I remembered what my last joke was. I skipped whatever I was talking about, remembered my last joke. And afterwards, the judges were very nice. They're like, aside from you, completely blanking on your set, here's what's good, here's what to work on. It was so awkward. My brother refused to watch me do stand up comedy for the next 4 years. Like, even after I got better, even I was like, no, I don't blank on stage anymore. I'm actually good. He's like, nope, I refuse. It was so awkward for him because it was so awkward for me.
Hmm.
He wouldn't even watch videos of me doing where I'm like, no, I was good in this. It's from start to, he's like, nope, can't do it.
Ugh.
And for a while, I was like, okay, well, clearly I'm never going to do comedy again, right? That's failure, so I must be done. And
Yeah.
then I came across this interview with Dave Chappelle.
Hmm.
And in it, Dave Chappelle talked about the moment that he knew he could do comedy was when he bombed for the first time really
Hmm.
bad, right? So in comedy, if you don't do well, it's called bombing.
Yep.
And what he said was, he's like, I realized that for one, it was terrible. I did not like it. But two, as a comedian, that's the worst that can happen. Right. He's like, I
Hmm.
wasn't shot. I wasn't injured. I wasn't fit. Like it didn't feel good, but I wasn't physically hurt. And I've already had that rock bottom. It's not going to really get much worse than that. So I've only got up to go.
Yeah.
And it took a little while, but having that mindset of, again, oh, failure is just data. Okay, so what can I learn from that experience? Well, one, I need more reps so I don't get nervous when I'm, presenting in front of 200 people or 1,000 people or 2,000 people. And two, don't memorize word for word. Like, I stopped memorizing word for word after that and
Hmm.
became more extemporaneous, where I still know my setup and punchline, but I don't have to say exact, because I was trying to, and people do this all the time with presentations, which is one of the things that we try to coach out of people is,
Hmm.
it's not about getting right to a script. Like once you are presenting in front of someone, they only know you messed up if you tell them you've messed up, because they don't have a copy of the script. They're not reading along to say, oh, you missed a word, you're supposed to put that over here, right? No, right? So you just become this is where the improv mentality helps, of like being present in the moment and executing to the best of your ability in that moment.
That's really helpful. So take me to the basics just for a couple of minutes. Let's say I'm listening to this or watching this and I'm like, I'm intrigued. I like this idea of using humor. I don't particularly think of myself as a super funny person, or I recognize that I have this mental model that humor isn't quite at home in the workplace, but okay, I'm willing to give it a shot. Where do I start?
Great question. And so we do believe, certainly that humor is a skill, which means it can be learned. Right. And so that comes from me having learned how to use humor. Kind of three areas of the skill of humor. The first is your sense of humor. And as you get more comfortable with your own sense of humor, what you find interesting, you start to see the world in an interesting way. Right. Because I don't think that funny things happen to funny people. I think funny people see the things that happen to them in a funny way. And so one of the best ways to do that is just start keeping a humor notebook. Keep a repository of when something crazy happens to you, when something makes you laugh. When you think of this kind of funny, interesting idea, it goes down in a humor notebook. And what that does is, one, when you want to write humor a little bit later, like, I want to send a tweet, or I want to make a Facebook post that's kind of funny, or maybe I want to use a little bit of humor in this upcoming sales call. Oh, well, you can go back to the humor notebook and be like, oh, here is this interesting story about this other client that I had that I can make anonymous, but also will make a point that I'm trying to make, right? That notebook allows it so that you don't have to start from scratch. But the other thing that happens is, just by writing things down in the notebook, you, I think, start to train your brain to start to look for those things a little bit more. So that's step number one, is to keep a humor notebook. It can be a physical notebook. It can be Evernote. Like I use Evernote on my phone. It could be your notes app on your phone, whatever you want, but one spot that you put those things in there. And those ideas, they don't have to be fully like fleshed out. For a long time in my humor notebook, I had something about mono, like the kissing disease, and stereo. And I was like, I don't know what that is. That's interesting me eventually. And there's like one day I was like, all right, I think I'm going to tweet about that. Oh, okay. If you get mono twice, does it become stereo? Right? A silly joke. So it just starts with an observation you can come back to and work into humor. Step number two is your ability to humor, right? So you have your sense of humor, what you find interesting, funny about the world. Then you have your ability to humor. This is kind of the craft of stand-up. This is understanding things like, setup and punchline, structure, delivery, the importance of timing and waiting. You can learn certain structures, like a comic triple is probably one of the most common, one of the most well-known. A comic triple is, I'll talk about being an engineer. As a kid, I used to like to take things apart and then put them back together again. Things like clocks and radios and my parents' marriage, which never got that back. Right. So that's a comic triple. It's a list of three things. The first two are a normal kind of set of lists. That third thing is something unexpected. So people can learn the craft of that. That comes from taking an improv class, taking a stand-up class. We've got a bunch of free resources on our website, is what we teach in our workshops as well. But you can learn that craft. So that's step number two, right? So you have your sense of humor, you have your ability to humor. And then the final piece is your agency with humor. And this is your ability to use humor to achieve a specific result. And this goes back to the map that we talked about earlier. It's like, okay, thinking about strategically, okay, coming up, if I'm like, okay, I want to use humor, what's in my next hour that I'm going to do? What's one way that I can use humor to help me further the goal that I'm trying to do? Okay, if I'm working on, if I'm going through emails and doing some kind of more, data entry or that kind of stuff, can I listen to a comedy podcast so I'm kind of laughing while I'm doing it? Or, I'm doing a Zoom meeting. Can I start that Zoom meeting with a question that I'm going to ask everyone that's kind of interesting, just of like, what Netflix series are you watching right now that you're kind of stuck indoors? Okay, let's start to build. Because one of the other things that's important to understand is that humor is more broad than comedy. It's very intentional that our company is humor that works and not comedy that works. Because comedy is about laughter. Comedy is about making people laugh. Humor includes that, but it's also about maybe just making people smile, just amusing them. It's less about being funny and more about being fun. And so allowing yourself kind of some of that leeway. And that's what's interesting about humor in the workplace, is that it's so dry and boring typically to begin with, that you don't have to be Chris Rock or Ali Wong levels of funny at work, you can just be a little bit better, more interesting than normal, and that's going to go a long way. So those are the three things, right? Is your sense of humor, keeping a humor notebook, your ability to humor by practicing and repetition, and then your agency with humor by kind of really thinking through the humor map.
God, Drew, that's so helpful. Thank you for sharing that. So, last question. Is there anything, a lot of us are looking for things to cope with stress and anxiety right now. Is there anything in particular that you've read or watched recently that you found really funny that you'd recommend?
There's a ton of stuff. I'm a huge fan of. It's a couple years old now, but a huge fan of Hannah Gatsby. Nanette is very good. Can't wait for a new Netflix special to come out. A big fan of Seth Meyers. His stand-up special, I think, is very, very good. He does some fun, interesting takes in there. So a huge fan of that one. Ali Wong, it's a little bit raunchier, a little bit dirtier, but the comedy stuff is very, very funny. So Netflix comedy specials, I think, are a great way to do it. I am a big fan of Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I think is good quality content out there for sure. And Trevor Noah. Actually, Trevor Noah's stand-up. He has a YouTube channel dedicated to a lot of his international comedy, and he is so good with accents and cultural references and things like that. They're all places that all different comedians that I really enjoy watching.
Man, thank you for those recommendations. I appreciate that. Finally, how can folks connect with you, learn more about what you do, hear from you? Where can we find you?
Sure. Yeah. If people want to learn more about humor in the workplace, they can go to humorthatworks.com. We've got a bunch of free resources up there on learning humor. You can find out information about our books and our workshops. And we're doing a virtual open mic tonight. We're doing some virtual improv classes in different places. So we're also doing some virtual stuff with some of our clients as well, as a way to, like you said, right now in particular is an important time for teaching, some of these skills. Specific questions, they want to ask me specific questions. You can find me on social media at Drew Tarvin, DREWTAR, V as in Victor, IN. I tweet puns most every single day. If that's what you're looking for, you can do that. Or you can also, send me questions or things like that. But I would say the last thing that I would say is if people are like, I don't want to do any of that, what we do encourage pretty much all of the audiences that we speak with and groups that we share information with is to simply start thinking 1 smile per hour, right? Like each hour of the day, what's one thing that you can do? Not necessarily just smiling. For some people, that's a start. But what's one thing that you can do that would generate a smile, either for yourself or for someone else? And that starts to develop a humor habit. There's more and more the easy ways that you can incorporate humor into your workplace, which then, like we talked about earlier, helps you to be more productive, less stressed, and happier.
Drew, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to talk about this. I love the work that you're doing. I continue to wish you well. Stay safe. And I really appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me and for bringing hopefully we can bring some levity and some humor during these challenging times.
So what can we do with this? I've got some homework for you. First, I think you should follow the recommendations Drew gave. There's some pretty simple steps you can take to integrate humor into how you communicate with people. And as we talked about, I think it's even more important right now as physical distance tends to stretch that trust that we built up when we could be face to face. Humor is something, in my experience as a coach and facilitator, that can really help rebuild trust. Something I'd like you to do personally that we didn't talk about with Drew, though, I'd like you to just consider how humor might allow you to be more human in your relationships with the people you work with. So maybe in a crisis or when things start to feel out of control, you tend to clamp down and reassert control. And maybe when you start meetings, your temptation is to just jump right into the content and you push past the relational elements. And some of those relational elements can include humor and funny stories and jokes. In a crisis, it is tempting to clamp down and let that stuff go, but I think that would be a poor decision. I think it ends up eroding trust on teams. So just a personal note from me, what can you do to be more human in how you relate with your teams? And in what ways can humor help you be more human? Thank you so much for listening to Work Like a Human. See you next time. We would love to hear from you. Did you find this helpful? What other ideas do you have for episodes? And do you have questions about anything and everything related to leadership, human development, coaching, any related topics? We would love to be able to answer some of those, or at least have conversations about them on future episodes. Send an email to hello@go-innovation.com. That's hello@go-innovation.com, and let us know what you think, or send us a question. Thank you so much for listening.